Friends, colleagues and distinguished guests, my name, for those of you who don't know, is Peggotty Graham, and I'm the Dean of Social Sciences. And of course, Social Sciences has the pleasure of having Janet Newman as a member of our staff, Professor Janet Newman. But it's my pleasure to start with to welcome you all here and to say thank you for coming. I'm sure we're in for a great treat, and one that I'm sure we'll all go away feeling extremely stimulated by. I'll now introduce Professor Gurley, who will in turn introduce Janet to you.
Yes, well, once again, may I add my words of welcome to those of the Dean. It's a pleasure to welcome you all here today to Janet Newman's inaugural lecture. Janet started life as a librarian, which was something I didn't know until I did my bit of homework here. And of course, like one would expect from somebody like Janet, during her library career, she was involved in all sorts of interesting things. In the development and opening of one of the departments in the new Central Library, in a project to regenerate inner city libraries, in the planning and management of an innovative multi-purpose centre in Small Heath, Birmingham. She was also involved in community, feminists, there's a big surprise, and other forms of political activity in Birmingham through the 1970s and the 1980s. And it was during this period that Janet studied for her undergraduate degree at the Open University, gaining, of course, a first-class honours degree in 1981. She also began teaching for the Open University, tutoring on D102, the Social Science Foundation course, a third-level social policy course, and a course on women and management. 1985, she left her library career to undertake a PhD in the School of Education at the OU, gaining her doctorate on sex education and social change perspective on the 1960s. And while studying for her doctorate, she took a part-time post with the Women and Work program at the University of Aston, being promoted to senior lecturer and then director following its relocation to Coventry Polytech. She moved to the Institute of Local Government Studies in the School of Public Policy at the University of Birmingham and was appointed Professor of Social Policy at the Open University in 2002. Over the last 10 years, she has written or co-authored 5 books, and 2 are due to be published next year. Her book, Modernising Governance, New Labour, Policy and Society, is one of the most cited on New Labour. In the same period, she'd written some 24 book chapters and has had 21 articles accepted by referee journals. Her work at the interface of policy and public services means that she's been closely involved in policy development and evaluation and is currently an academic advisor to the Department of Health in relation to the programs of research on the modernisation of adult social care. As well as generating extensive research income from government and non-government bodies, she's worked on 3 ESRC research projects, including the current ESRC AHRB project on creating citizen consumers, working, of course, with colleagues at the Open University. One gets the feeling that she's very much in her stride. It gives me enormous pleasure to hand you over to Janet for an inaugural lecture, Going Public, People, Politics, Policy and Politics.
Thank you, Vice Chancellor. So thank you, and I just want to say a very warm welcome to everybody who's come, friends and colleagues, past and present. Now, I've called this lecture Going Public because I'm increasingly concerned about the difficulty of speaking the language of the public in contemporary political discourse. But this is not just a question of language. Despite the focus by all the main political parties on public services in the last election, and indeed in the recent manifesto, The Guardian was full of it this morning, the publicness of those services is somehow under question. It's viewed as something to do with the old social democratic welfare state rather than the new world of modernity, flexibility and consumerism. But the lecture isn't going to be one that looks back regretfully. It's not going to be a nostalgic lecture apart from maybe one point towards the end. Rather, I want to talk about a key dilemma. And it's a dilemma that comes out of my experience of crossing and recrossing the boundary between academic life and what those outside the academy like to call the real world. And the dilemma is how to hold together a critical understanding of the public alongside a political commitment to its importance. Now, as an academic, I know that notions of the public are constituted and contested, mobile and elusive. I know that there's no autonomous public realm, that the public exists only in and through articulations with various forms of private. And here's some of the ways in which that opposition works. Indeed, Michael Warner, one of the leading cultural theorists in this field, has argued, and I really like this quote, almost every cultural change from Christianity to printing to psychoanalysis has left a new sedimentary layer in the meaning of the public and private. And we can see those new sedimentary layers continuing to be added at the same time as notions of publicness are becoming more problematic. In the 20th century, a succession of political and social movements challenged the idea that politics was something that took place in a public domain of rational deliberation, while the domestic and personal was outside politics. And in the 21st century, what we're seeing are attempts to remake the public in more governable forms, and I'll say more about that later, while at the same time dealing with the dislocations of race, culture, identity, and post-colonial anxiety. All of this means that it's become increasingly difficult to speak about a public domain and to think about how we should act in it. But despite all that, I remain someone still closely engaged with the fortunes of the public sector, of those who work in it, and those who benefit from it or not. And as such, I want to argue that notions of publicness still matter, that the publicness of public institutions is something to be struggled over. And the space formed at the interface between these two positions, the idea that it's complex and difficult, but on the other hand that it's important, has significant implications for all of those involved in education, policy development, or the delivery of public services, that is, for most of us in this room, who, despite the trials of modernisation and the poverty of its discourse, still care passionately about what we do. In what follows, I want to do three things. First, delineate some of the terrains on which the contemporary politics of the public is being struggled over. Then use some of my own research to trace what I think are some critical issues in the remaking of public policy and public services. And finally, go back to the dilemma that I began with and suggest ways in which it might be possible to think about the role of the public intellectual, whether inside or outside the academy, in restating a politics of publicness. Okay, all right so far? Good. This is a moment when struggles over what is and what is not a public matter are intensifying. Struggles over security, with the dismantling of the protections of privacy following 9/11 and the new politics of fear, and the intrusions onto public space, intrusions that I think Hood is an entirely rational response to, I have to say. Struggles over the environment and the private use of global resources, issues such as cheap air transport, though I have to say I will be benefiting from this next week. Struggles over the environment and the private use of global resources. Struggles over access to and the use of resources, land, food and water as collective but unequally distributed resources. Struggles around sexuality, about how far the state may regulate or intervene into the private, what sexualities are publicly recognised, and what practices may occupy public space. Struggles over reproduction, with advances in genetic engineering, and struggles over the ownership of those technologies. And even struggles over that most personal moment, death, with more and more conflicts about the right to die hitting the headlines, and with debates about who can decide to terminate life intensifying, even this week.